How's everybody doing? Okay. So last week when we looked at successful example of the implementation of subversion. What is subversion again? Okay, of a society or a group of people. Okay. So we looked at Russia back in the early 1900s when they went through the October Revolution. So they went from essentially a democratic government to a communist Marxist government. So if you remember, the people began to be unhappy with their government. They were unhappy with their situation with the war. They were in extreme debt. And Lenin, being excommunicated to Switzerland, came back, and him and the Bolsheviks incited what Russia calls the peasants, the blue-collar folk, to go on strikes, to incite violence against their employers, and eventually they revolted against the government. So on the backs of the blue-collar workers, Lenin came to power along with the Bolsheviks, and eventually the same people that joined Lenin's army, the blue-collar workers, farmers, peasants, were sent off to gulags by both Lenin and Stalin. So wasn't really what they foresaw in their revolution, right? So the majority of the peasants were farmers, and they were tasked with, by the government, by the communist government, that they had to send all the surplus of their crop to the government for distribution. And when the farmers began keeping their surplus to themselves, hiding it, Russia went through a food shortage. So Stalin and Lenin began hauling off the farmers to the gulags and replacing them with social workers or government employees to farm. And obviously they did not have adequate knowledge of how to farm. And so that's when Russia saw one of the biggest, starvation periods in their history. Okay? And I also want to clarify, Pastor asked if socialism is the same as communism. And at the root, they have the same goal. The word commune is at the root of both ideas. So the idea is to distribute surplus and goods and services equally among people, but the method in doing is different. So in socialism, it's done through a more democratic process, where communist is done through a tyrannical government, basically. And if you go out and ask, people who are socialists what a socialist government looks like, you'll get, 50 different answers. So it's kind of changed over time, but at the root, they have the same goal, to distribute equally among the people. All right. So, where's the clicker? Make sure that I covered everything. Any questions so far? Those who were gone last week? Okay. So now I want to look at, really quick, an example of subversion in current day? Turn it on. So current forms of subversion. What are some of the popular movements going on today? Vegans? Black Lives Matter? Okay. That's a good one. BLM. So currently, the Black Lives Matter movement is the largest protest in U.S. history. 15 to 26 million people is the latest poll from your biggest four polling organizations. So it's influencing a lot of people and a lot of aspects of our society. So this is just a map to show all the areas where they've had BLM rights, or sorry, not rights, protests.
I think that you should have Seattle on there with Chaz. That was part of that.
Yeah. Yep. But that was more Antifa, wasn't it?
There's no difference anymore.
No, but at the time there was. It's
No.
no, you don't. Well,
60% of the people arrested in New York were from out of state.
yeah.
Antifa. Anyways, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
I've been reading a lot recently on all this stuff.
Yeah. So why do I mention Black Lives Matter? When I go to work, I'll probably see 5 to 10 stickers on the back of everybody's cars that, Black Lives Matter. And I think, and especially talking with, people I work with, they don't understand the organization that's called Black Lives Matter that they support. There's a lot, and they're an easy target to pick because, as I'll talk about later, they incorporate ideologies that have been around probably, the 80s, the 70s, the 90s, and so I'm not dissing Black Lives Matter. I'm just picking them because they've implemented ideology that's been around for a long time. And because one of their co-founders, Patrice, this is straight out of an interview that she did. I think it was with CBS or CSNBC. She said, "We do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia, who is one of the other co-founders, in particular, are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on a sort of ideological theory, and I think what we really try to do is build a movement that could be utilized by many black folk." So both her and Alicia support the Marxist movement. And if you remember, what's Marxism? Communism, right? Marxist one that developed the Communist Manifesto. So there's 3 women that are in charge of Black Lives Matter that organize it. And this is their ideology, Marxism. If you go directly to the BLM website and read their mission statement, one of them is to move past nationalism. What's nationalism? Used to be just being an American, right? I support our military. I love America. I love freedom. I cite the Pledge of Allegiance every morning.
Is that different than patriotism?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Different than what?
Patriotism.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah, it's different now. I thought nationalism was pride and investment in the nation in which you live. Anybody, I thought patriotism and nationalism were somewhat interchangeable, and it's,
I think it is for us.
Yeah.
meaning for us.
Well, for Americans.
So
But if you go to Italy,
if you have Italians that are,
well, what do they call themselves? You know, we call ourselves patriots, but Italians could be,
is patriot an American term?
Italians.
No.
Italians.
Well, the way they're using that there in that statement is that nationalism is the current structure of our nation. But nationalism, in its purest form, I would agree, is the same as patriotism. We believe in our country and advancing our country as a whole. But the way that the narrative that's been set up now is that nationalism is the current status quo, and we're trying to change the current status quo. So nationalism is now viewed as a bad thing. And patriotism, by default, means that you're a nationalist, so you get placed in that, lumped in with that same, that same negative stigma that the narrative produces.
Yep. So part of that nationalism is our economy. So our current economy is capitalism, or in some cases crony capitalism. And BLM's goal is to overstate or overturn capitalism and move to a more socialistic, Marxist economy. Huh?
Does it say that? Or are we reading into that?
Yes, and I don't think I put it. It doesn't say that on the website, but if you go back and read some of the interviews that Patrice and Alicia have done, that's part of their goals.
Oh, okay.
And you'll see that when we start getting into we'll cover real quick the critical race theory. So their view is that capitalism is a white man's economic system. It favors white people, and I don't want to jump forward, but so we'll come back to that. Social structure. So family, this is quote from one of the directors at Black Lives Matter, Kaylee Scales. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. So their goal is to disrupt our traditional family structure and to make it a more communal environment. Sounds like the same statement that Hillary. Remember Hillary had the popular statement? It takes a village to raise children. Yep. All right, so economically, social structure, labor. So major corporations are starting to require their employees to go through what they call anti-racism or critical race theory training. And this is training, or there were several institutions back in the 90s that were hired to create a course and instruction on critical race theory or anti-racism. So one of those is the Aspen Institution, and the other is Center of Assessment and Policy Development. So they compiled a list of training requirements that a lot of the larger corporations now are starting to implement, that their employees have to go through. So from this policy, it states that racism is present in every aspect of life, every relationship, and every interaction. Doesn't matter what we do in our culture, racism exists. White individuals only provide black people opportunities and freedoms when it is also in their own interests. And the thought is this is derived from capitalism. So capitalism is, as I said, a white-based society, an economy that was developed by a white-based society. Only treats race issues as socially constructed groups, so there are no individuals who are specifically racist. So the idea there is, I think there were 3 black people that went to my high school, and if you were to ask them if our nation is racism, they say no. I mean, 2 of them were a lot better off than my parents were. One got a full ride scholarship to CU on football. So if you ask them if the nation's racist, they would tell you no. But the idea is that it doesn't matter what they experience as an individual. The more important thing is that our society has been socially constructed on racism. Even though they didn't experience it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Did you pull this out of a specific training, or?
Yeah, this is out of the Aspen Institution.
Okay.
It's like a 40-page training document. Another one is science, reason, and evidence are founded from white societies that do not offer a black alternative. So this was just last week, the MAA, Mathematical Association of America, released a statement that says, it is time for all members of our profession to acknowledge that mathematics is created by humans and therefore inherently carries human biases. Until this occurs, our community and our students cannot reach full potential. Reaching this potential in mathematics relies upon the academy and higher education to engage in critical, challenging, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about detrimental effects of race and racism on our community. So the time is now to move mathematics and education forward in pursuit of justice. So basically, they're saying the mathematics system that we've established is based on a racist society, a white society, and that it's time to reevaluate the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. Huh?
I'm not reading that at all.
Science, reason, and evidence founded on white societies.
What I read from that statement is the academic community is realizing they need to pull in more black intellectuals to further the course of mathematics and science.
Right, but that's not the way it's being taken. There's people that are saying 2 + 2 does not equal 4.
How?
That's a good question.
I'm sorry.
Was that part of a fuller statement? Because I agree with all of it. That's how I'm reading it too.
Yeah. So, let me see if I got it here.
We're just trying to understand. We know
No, I understand. Yeah, I'll see what else I can pull on that. But the reason why I brought this up is because there's a movement now that's trying to redefine basic mathematics. Like I said, 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. I was just reading an article about this last week, that it's a social construct, which I know it sounds ridiculous. I didn't believe it when I saw it. But there's a lot of folks that are saying the mathematical, even physics, There's probably a similar statement that physics is also based on a white social construct and needs to be reevaluated. And that is, I actually listened to this on a podcast. That was from Professor of Physics Chandra Prescott Weinstein. But he had a good, the majority of his point is the fact that different cultures offer like you were saying, they offer a different viewpoint, So sometimes when we analyze physics or theories, that in the history, that's mainly been conducted by white people. And to include, different people of race or people of different race will benefit in how we, analyze and conduct research, offer different viewpoints. So another statement rejects all potential alternatives like color blindness or all lives matter, and also being a form of racism. So you've heard the people going around asking, they go to restaurants and tell people to get on their knees and say that, Black Lives Matter. You haven't seen that? Yeah. Most recent case was in Louisville. So there's a group of BLM supporters that went to restaurants. They upturned tables, told people to get on their knees, and acknowledged that Black Lives Matter. And people that said all lives matter were considered racist, that was anti-racism. This guy, one example was this guy from Jordan, Fadi Fari, I don't even know how to say his name, Fari, was sitting in front of his business trying to keep people from breaking in or, rioting and breaking through his business, stealing stuff, which was going on in, I think this is in Louisville. And a group of BLM members came up to him and said, do Black Lives Matter? And as I said here, a group of BLMs told him to say Black Lives Matter, in which he said, all lives matter. If you're a good person, I will care about you. If you're a bad person. And then, luckily there, because I think partly because he was immigrant, they didn't, they didn't destroy his business, but he had like 50 people surrounding him, trying to force him to say that Black Lives Matter. And he kept saying, all lives matter. So that's one of the current movements going on right now in our nation is, and again, I'm not picking on Black Lives Matter. It's this idea that our current economic system, our current family structure, is at its core. Again, I'm trying to think of a good way to put it. It's at its core kind of is racist. It's structured by white people. Am I making sense? Kind of sweating because it's a touchy subject. And we're all white.
We got to this point, we did it to ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I make a statement?
Sure.
Scripture says, and that's all we should care about,
Right.
that and I want to be careful how I say this. I don't want to misquote the Lord. We're supposed to love all people. Period.
Right.
Regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless. So for us, this should not be a big deal. However, Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America.
Yeah.
So why is that? There is a problem. Denying there's a problem is silly when we have facts in front of us. But the way Christ would handle the problem, and I think that you're saying that this is an example of subversion, are very different approaches to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because one tries to force people's thinking, not change people's thinking, but force people's thinking. And the Lord is concerned about changing their hearts to change their minds.
Right.
Completely opposite ways to go about it. So just within the context of our discussion, this is really valuable, but we have to always remember where we stand as the Lord's people and subject our views to what His Word tells us.
Right.
So this is very important for us to have, because we are to engage our society. And if we engage our society on one side or the other, then we're wrong. We need to engage society from the standpoint of being ambassadors for Christ and no other. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And that ultimately what I'm trying to get to is the fact that, like, we're not safe from, movements like this. In our whole history, I mean, we still deal with things in our theology that were influenced by movements like this, ideologies. So, and that's what I want to get into next. So, we went over a failed example of subversion, a successful example of subversion, and what I consider to be a current one that's going on in our world. And again, I'm not picking on Black Lives Matter. They're an easy target because they incorporate a lot of, the idea of changing our economy from capitalist to Marxist has been around since the 50s. There's always been a group of people that have been, specifically professors. Some of us that have went to college, I had a couple professors that still thought that socialists or Marxism was a better solution than capitalism. So it's been around for a long time. It's just, here we have an organization that encapsulates some of those ideas. So why do we concern ourselves as this church with subversion? So subversion uses the momentum and the ideology and attitude of the time to influence individuals, sometimes making what would be considered nonsense in the past to being common sense now. It achieves through ideology. It's achieved through ideology rather than organizations, which makes it less apparent until it's been fully integrated into society. And next, it's usually impossible to reverse. So, going back to Russia, you think those people knew that the movements that they were implementing or taking part of would have led to them being essentially a communist dictatorship and being sent to the gulag? Probably not.
How many buildings are
So subversion is hard to pinpoint. It's also impossible to quantify the effects of ideology and the effects that it'll have on society until it becomes basically a history study. It's hard to understand, the outreach that ideas and movements will have until they've actually happened. So the immediate effects of an ideological movement can be understood as these are usually the intended goal, but there's oftentimes unintentional effects that cannot be known. So, a good example is the Asian carp. In the Midwest, they integrated the Asian carp to minimize, a fish, yeah.
Thank you. I couldn't understand what you're sorry.
to remove and minimize algae and certain aquatic plants in the water source that they used for agriculture. But what they didn't know is how much the Asian carp would affect our ecosystem. There we go. So now they go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's the same in Hawaii. The mongoose is not really a native animal there. You brought it over for the rat problem. Now there's an infestation of mongoose.
Yeah. So they understood the immediate intention of introducing carp, but they didn't understand how introducing carp would have a total effect on the ecosystem. What time is it? Yeah. So, as I said, Christianity has not remained uninfluenced by subversion and ideology. And one of those ways is a change in understanding. So at some point in the 3rd century, there was a departure amongst believers on how Scripture was understood. It went from understanding Scripture from a historical context to a philosophical one. So knowledge for decision making, when I say philosophical, what I mean is knowledge for decision making and finding explanations was approached from, or is approached from a philosophical or metaphysical viewpoint. So what do I mean when I say metaphysical? Usually the metaphysical deals with abstract concepts such as, being, who am I, why am I here, knowing, substance, identity, time, and space also. So it even deals with, more, it includes physics, I guess I should say. Also, when I say philosophical standpoint, understanding and answers are sought out by studying Scripture for divine ideas that exist behind biblical accounts. So, one example, for those of you who were at Bible camp a couple years ago, a pastor went over how Genesis chapter 2 and 3 are used when scientists that are Christian try to describe how the earth was made. That's more of a philosophical approach, because that's not how Genesis was intended to be used. It was a historical account. It was a people, Israel, who were raised by a polytheistic society, Egypt. And so Moses presented the way, these methods or the things that were created by God because Egypt had a God for every one of those things that he mentioned God created. So its intention wasn't to describe how the earth was made. Its intention was to provide an account historically for Israel to know that God was the only God, the true God. Wasn't intended to be a science book. The philosophical approach left Scripture open to subjective interpretation. So when we say divine ideas, I don't know, those of you who were Protestants before you came here, like me, one of the common things to do is just grab a verse like John 3:16 and add a divine idea behind it. instead of looking at it with a full context. So, philosophical approach left Scripture open to subjective interpretation. Divine ideas could be perceived to fit experiences, situations, and needs in our life rather than life being subjected to fit Scripture. So that's the philosophical approach allowed us to contour Scripture around to fit our life instead of the other way around. And this approach, this philosophical approach, is the primary reason why the purpose of God has been lost among people. And that's what gave rise to Gnosticism. So what is Gnosticism? It's hard to explain, huh?
We don't really know. We're not going to worry about it because we can't explain it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that came out of Gnosticism that's still around is the division of God between the Old and New Covenant. So they separate the God of Old Covenant with the God of New Covenant. So the God of the Old Covenant was a more physical, judgmental God who immediately, interacted with his people, where now God is a spiritual God. And he deals indirectly with his people.
Yeah, people who, the Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah, I found out, I stopped studying it because it just went right into Gnosticism, and it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's also where the division of the material, which is unimportant, and the spiritual is ultimately important. So we don't really care about what we do in the flesh because it doesn't matter. It's a material.
Right.
It's part of Gnosticism as well.
And Scripture too. So, coming from Protestantism, I remember when I was given a Bible that didn't even have the Old Covenant in it. It was all New Testament books. Because, for one, I could never correlate the Old Covenant with the New Covenant. I mean, I thought the Old Covenant was just a bunch of history, but now, now it's like, man, you can't have one without the other. So that's one lasting effect of Gnosticism, because it still exists. I mean, there's still, very popular idea that God has changed, essentially. So God did not reveal himself through a philosophical system. So although it's enjoyable to somewhat consider the metaphysics of Scripture, I think about how God operates outside of time. I enjoy looking at it from a scientific approach, but ultimately that's not how God revealed himself to man. God entered human history to accomplish his purpose and to reveal to us his requirements and his attributes. What time is it? I got 5 minutes. Why don't we stop there? We'll continue next week on how ideology and subversion has affected Christianity. Okay? All right. Kind of wish I didn't touch on Black Lives Matter. I don't know.
It was a good example.
Yeah. I should have more information for you guys.